Woolrich is one of America's oldest companies, tracing their history all the way back to their founding in 1830. That's like 200 years of making clothing, and so it's a lot of history. Today we're going to look at how to identify vintage Woolrich garments. Now we're not going to go all the way back to the 1800s, but we'll go back roughly 100 years and see how we can identify and narrow down the era from which your Woolrich garments come. Let's take a look. Welcome, people of planet Earth and all planets beyond. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Josh. And yeah, we're not going to go all the way back to the 1800s. I think if you had a garment from the 1800s, it would be fairly recognizable as, wow, this is really old, and probably not from any recent time. But we're going to go back to approximately 1930, so about 100 years of history. And these are probably the most common Woolrich items you'll most likely run into if you're out and about digging or buying or collecting yourself. So we're going to take a look at those eras first and foremost. So on this channel, we use a definition of vintage as a garment that's 20 years or older. So that's what we're going to be looking for in this case. Now, as with most brands, one of the most important things that we're going to look for is the label. And that's where we're going to start off looking at Woolrich. We're going to look at the labels and the label history to give us an idea of how to identify our Woolrich garments. Now, one thing to note is a lot of brands actually include like codes and numbers and date codes and stuff on their labels and care tags, but as far as I can tell, Woolrich has never done that. So what we are only going to be able to do is get probably approximate to a decade or two for our garments. So, and that's about as specific as we can be. There might be a few occasions where we can be more specific, but in this video, we're going to try to just get to as narrow of a range as we can. Now, with Woolrich labels, there are basically three main eras. There is the modern era, which is basically anything that we won't consider as vintage. There's the middle era that lasted from like 65 to the early 2000s. And then there's the early era that lasted from the 1930s to 1965. We're gonna look at those three eras specifically and give you some pointers and details of those labels that can help us trace the approximate date of our Woolrich garments. So the first era we're going to look at is the modern era. There's been a lot of changes in the Woolrich logo. There's Woolrich with just the text, and there's a little bit of sheep, and there's some boxes, etc., etc. This is very common. In the last 20 years, they've changed up a lot. These are all examples of labels that at the very oldest are probably only as old as Y2K. So most of these garments that would have these labels on them we would not consider as vintage. So if you see any of these labels, know that you're probably not looking at a vintage Woolrich garment. So then the middle era, which is the most common era that you're going to find garments from. This is from 65 to 2000, and this is the era of the modern sheep logo. This logo is probably their most iconic look, and I'm bummed they don't use it as much anymore. But this one first was put into use in 1965. And was used in a variety of forms all the way into the early 2000s. So if your garment has this Woolrich logo, you're probably looking at a garment from at least 65 up until about the late 90s, early 2000s. Now there are a couple of variations within this period that I want to point out. One is the Woolrich Woman, which is a women's line. You can see here. This logo ran from 1980 to the early 2000s when it was officially abandoned as a trademark. So if you have a Woolrich Woman logo, you're looking at the earliest 1980 and at the latest probably I think it's 2000 or 2002 approximately. Then there was this label right here. This is the Woolrich Classics label. This one was first used in commerce in 1993. It doesn't appear to have a very long run, maybe a decade or so, though it was sort of reimagined in the last couple years for the Woolrich Archives line, which was sort of a higher end LVC type line that Woolrich released a few years ago. But generally speaking, if you see the Woolrich Classics logo, you can at least be relatively confident that it's only about as old as the 90s. So this Woolrich logo largely didn't change much during its time of use. The application or what it was printed on did, and sometimes the form of the label did change a little bit. but largely it stayed relatively the same. So we'll have to use some other methods that we'll talk about later in the video to try to isolate the age of garments using this label. There is one early label I do want to point out, and that's pretty interesting because I have it right here. Here you can see the Woolrich logo and label right here. But if you look closely, up here in the corner it says trademark applied for. And that's because you can use a brand or a logo in commerce before it's actually trademarked. So this is actually probably a very early transition in the mid-60s garment, because the trademark had been applied for but had not actually been granted, which I believe it was granted officially in 67. So I date this guy to about 65 to 67, around that time. So that's pretty cool. You can see it doesn't have any other tags or anything like that, just the size, no description of the material content or anything like that, but it does have this trademark applied for inscribed here on the logo, giving us a pretty good idea and indication that this was a very early version of the middle era Woolrich logo. Now let's take a look at the early era Woolrich logo. This is another really iconic one, but you can tell it's probably not nearly as iconic as that middle era one. I certainly like that one better than this one, but this one's pretty cool too. This one is pretty funny and interesting because there are a million sort of subtle variations of this logo going back into the 30s, maybe even late 20s. Like just tons of different little variations. In some cases, they don't ever look the same, it feels like, and that's probably because they might have been hand-stitched or something like that. So there's a lot of variations in this particular logo, so we're not going to look at every single one. There are some charts, or there's some guides out there that look at each one more specifically, but I think some general rules apply and they can be really helpful. First off, if you have this logo at all, this sheep logo with the red and the black background, you're looking at a garment most likely from the 30s to the mid-60s. Now, one of the important variations that we're going to look at is the trademark logo, or the R that you could attach to something that you had trademarked to protect the intellectual property of the trademark. The Trademark Act was passed in 1946, so any garment with the trademark logo can't be any older than 1946. So when we see this early version of the Woolrich logo and it has a trademark, we know that it's from 46 to approximately 65. And if it does not have the trademark logo, it's likely from earlier than 1946. Another variation on the early 60s and late 50s Woolrich logos is the grass beneath the feet of the sheep. This was added sometime in the late 50s and into the 60s. Now there are a couple other early variations that we can point to. And one of the early versions of the Woolrich logo actually included an element pretty unique to the very first ones. And that was the name John, Rich, and Brothers, which was a part of the name of Woolrich. That was only included on some of the very early versions in the 30s. That was taken off probably by the late 30s. So if you have John, Rich, and Brothers on this early label, you're looking at a garment probably from the early 1930s. So the Woolrich labels can get us to a pretty approximate date for the age of our Woolrich, but let's take a look at a few other pieces of information or tricks that can help us maybe get a little bit closer. The next method we're going to use to help identify the age of our Woolrich is where it was made. Specifically, we tend to think that most vintage garments were produced in America, and that is true largely. But specifically with Woolrich, they started manufacturing outside of the country in the early 90s, a bit ahead of the passing of NAFTA. And of course, after NAFTA, it became even more common. By the early 2000s, there was a lot of production in China. So if you have a Chinese-produced Woolrich, you can most likely assume that it's from that early 2000s or to present day. So other places Woolrich may have manufactured in the 90s were like Korea, or the Philippines, or Hong Kong. Now, these were pretty common textile producers in the 90s and in the 80s. But generally speaking, if your Woolrich is produced in America, that's a generally good indicator that it is vintage. It may not be absolutely 100%, but if you're using some of these other methods and your garment was produced in the USA, it's a pretty good chance that it is considered vintage. Now, generally for wool products, I would use the wool mark to help identify the age of a garment. But in the case of Woolrich, it's a little bit difficult to use it and almost redundant and unnecessary, because right about the time they changed their logo from the early version of the label to the middle version of the label, that was about the same time that the wool mark was invented and released in the market in, I think, 1964 or so. So generally speaking, it's kind of a redundant use of it. If it shows up on a Woolrich garment, it's also going to show up on the middle era logo, so it doesn't really help you get anywhere closer to a more specific date. But one element that would help you is the trademark Thinsulate. Thinsulate was a insulation material that was used particularly on garments like wool garments that had a maybe a nylon interior and had some sort of layer in addition to the wool, typically on jackets or so. But this trademark was registered in 1976. So if your Woolrich garment has a tag on it that says Thinsulate, you could be confident that it is no older than 1976. Now, one of the more reliable methods about dating any vintage garment is whether or not it includes wash instructions on a care tag or printed somewhere on the garment. That's because in 1971, a rule was passed that required all garment makers to include wash instructions on their garment. And generally speaking, it appears that with Woolrich, they started around that same time as well. So if your garment has a care or wash instruction attached to it, you can be pretty confident it is no older than 1971. Now, this is not the exhaustive list of all the different methods you can use to date vintage Woolrich, but this should get most people to a good approximate age of their garment and a good idea as to how old their garment actually is. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you need more help, I do have an email that you can email. It's called lootfam1@gmail.com. You can send me some photos of your Woolrich garment. I can take a look at it and see if I can help you identify an age for your Woolrich. I will admit, though, I do get a lot of emails, so I might be slightly delayed. But if you need some help, I would love to try to help if I can. So thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.